So thank you everyone for coming today. We have another popular culture dialogue. We're going to be taking on a topic that's kind of similar to, or at least related to the last one we did when we looked at the popular culture during the pandemic. And here though, we're going to focus on digital popular culture, which, as we talked about during the pandemic dialogue, has become kind of a big thing, especially compared to maybe to other pandemics we've gone through. But we can talk about, of course, digital popular culture in a larger sense as well. And I think there's a lot of different topics we can touch upon. So I am going to allow our participants to introduce themselves, what brings them here. We've got people from various places around the world right now coming together. And I think we'll just go from there. So I've got a lot of people. Again, tell us who you are, what brings you here, maybe briefly, so we can get into the meat and potatoes of the discussion. And I'm going to start over here with Christopher.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Christopher Zysik. I'm a PhD candidate at Paderborn University in Germany. So it's 11 p.m. right now. And I analyzed in my PhD thesis the Japanese music genre kawaii metal with post-colonial attempts and theory, concepts, etc. And I made some thoughts about digitality and popular culture, but I haven't made any concepts yet. So I hope this conversation will develop my thinking further. So yeah.
Wonderful. And we're going to go down below you on my monitor down to Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura. I'm doing a PhD in North American Studies in Alcalá, in Spain, so it's also 11 p.m. here. I work with media studies on my thesis, and I try to apply it to contemporary North American literature. So in general, I'm very interested in this line with communication and media studies. I'm also very interested in new media and digitality, and that's why I'm here today.
Go down below me to Christine.
Hello, I'm Christine. I'm a lecturer at the University of California, Irvine, and apologies for the phone. Hopefully that's okay. But I do mostly work on digital spaces, online spaces and culture, video games, and more broadly, kind of uses of and engagement with popular culture. So happy to be here. Happy to hear everyone's thoughts on this.
Thank you. And I see a what is it, a Deadpool bear behind you?
Yeah, that's Wade. He helps with my classes.
Good for Wade. And below you, going down to Tunisha.
Hi there. It's funny. I had my Ric Flair pop who helps me in my classes. Oh, where is he? He's buried in my Ric Flair pop. He helps me out. I'm Tunisha Singleton. I have my PhD in media psychology. I graduated in 2017. So I'm an adjunct faculty in the Department of Psychology teaching community psych and media psych. My area of expertise is in fandom, sports culture, and my dissertation was on digital fandomonium and how fan identity has evolved alongside multidimensional experiences of how we embrace and experience sport. I actually did, I think it was, last year, the WrestlePosium. It feels like so long. I'm like, was that this? Yeah, 2020. The WrestlePosium, where I did a presentation on like wrestling fandom, and at MPCA this year, did a panel on in sports culture and that focus for MMA and branding and athletes, and then also in the hockey area of studies where I'm on the board of director for Black Girls Hockey Club. So I'm really interested in how the digital space has created new opportunities to reinvent fandom and how we experience influencers, athletes, sports, and brands.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tunisha. We're going to go over to your side to Anuli. Oh, got to mute.
My name is Anuli. I'm a PhD student at NYU. I study cultural anthropology. My research looks at influence and marketing. That's why I said perfect. Through the lens of Black content creators in the US, I'm really interested in influencing and content creation as a job, as a career, and how it changes the ways we work and live. And I come into this work with over 6 years of experience working in the marketing industry, and I did consumer research and strategy and analytics, everything in marketing. So now I want to see the industry from the content creator side.
That's a huge one, especially during this year of the pandemic and how many people have gone to that type of work because they can't do anything else too.
Yeah, I actually recently wrote a paper about OnlyFans and how memberships to OnlyFans has increased during the pandemic and what that says about the role of pleasure in work.
Good, thank you for that. And we're going to go above you to Jess.
Hey everybody, glad to be here with you all today. Everybody's interests sound really awesome, so I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'm Jess Maddox. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Journalism and Creative Media at the University of Alabama. And my research looks at visual social media culture. So I look at the pop culture on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, memes, things like that. And I've kind of culminated all of that into the book that I have under contract with Rutgers right now called The Internet is for Cats, and looking at pet and animal, the visual cultures of pet and animal social media.
Fascinating. That'll be interesting. Great. And going above you to Jasmine.
Hi everyone, my name is Jasmine Stork. I am a graduate student at Ohio State University, so I'm writing my dissertation right now. And my focus is actually on asexuality in fan fiction. So I'm looking at fandoms and fan fiction and the ways that asexuality is represented and talked about, and sort of ways to think about doing online research that can actually be applied in other professions. I have a master's in public health. And one of the big moves right now is trying to figure out how to reach populations that are hard to reach, and to do programming when you are not getting the information that you need from the sort of big outside studies, how to get that information and how to approach people and do that qualitative research. So I'm doing it not through public health. I'm in a cultural studies program instead. But my goal is to think about how these different fields are actually really useful if we talk to each other, and how we can position more graduate students who know how to do the talking with the fields and professions that need to get to talk together and just kind of need a buddy for that.
Glad to hear it. And I also have to give a shout out to a fellow OSU alum, or future alum. And then we'll go over to Matthew.
Hey, how's it going? Can you guys hear me? I think I'm unmuted. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, you're good.
My name's Matthew. I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Communication, Austin Peay State University. I study fandom and participatory culture, primarily cosplay and material culture, the things that people make. But the way it intersects with digital culture is I'm looking at the ways in which people kind of monetize those hobbies and turn them into a business, or aspire to. A lot of people don't succeed, but they desire to turn their cosplaying into a full-time business, as whether they're a creator or they're someone who sells those things on Etsy or eBay. And then I'm a kind of a digital content creator. I feel like I've been thrust in that because of COVID. So a lot of my life these days is producing video essays on pop culture stuff. And then I'm trying a series right now on tips and tricks on how to teach better or more effectively online, aimed at faculty and people who are educators. And so that's my life these days. And my dog's over there. So if you see me do this, it's to touch a dog.
I will say you definitely have a much more professional microphone setup than I have going on right now. I'm a bit on the jealous side of that mic.
These Yetis are pretty great. They're about $100, which is not a small investment, but it's been well worth it. It's made my life so much easier. Though I do drop it and I've hit myself with it in the teeth and other things, but it works other than the damage to the face. It's pretty good.
And on that ringing endorsement, let's go down to Heidi.
Hello. Wow, I'm thrilled to be in this Zoom room full of awesome studies and people, it seems like. So I am in Denver, Colorado, and I'm in the joint PhD program here in the study of religion, but my focus is on film and television and media studies, particularly with on-screen storytelling. So usually things like film and TV, but also video games and other kinds of emerging storytelling. But also specifically how these modes of storytelling are changing with streaming services and things like that, and how that changes our watching habits and our sort of communal watching habits. So the digital realm of things really crops up with that in the ways that we interact with each other when we're watching, and how in general these stories then affect sort of larger narrative stories, hence the religious studies piece comes back in. So just general how we all see the world through different narratives, how they manifest materially in our real world communities, and then the more like actual physical material elements of, you know, buying things and having things in our homes and the way that we interact when we're watching things or fanning over things.
I might have to pick your brain at another time talking more about the QAnon narratives too and how that relates to all of this.
Oh, yeah.
'Cause that'd be
I've actually
fascinating.
sort of pivoted my dissertation focus to have QAnon as a potential case study, seeing as I accidentally became way too interested in it in the last 2 years, and then it didn't go away. So yeah, if anyone has QAnon questions, I unfortunately know way too much about it, so I can answer questions, sadly.
Well, great. And those might come up, but I kind of want to start with a really basic question first. What is digital popular culture? Like, when you think about that, when you think about what would be considered digital popular culture, what comes to mind for you? And I kind of want to throw it open to who'd ever like to start, who has ever got a answer for that first.
You know, I'll jump in because I actually just finished helping produce this virtual event called New Public that was put on by Civic Signals, and many of the discussions that came up, and the audience includes, you know, traditional artists, photographers, performers, scholars, singers, every multidisciplinary audience, and there was a big concern about empathy, connection, the bullying, the trolling, like all of that stuff. Like, how do you regulate a digital space as you would a public space, and hence New Public. But one of the things that they had said, though, that I thought was interesting, and I even wrote it down, like they were saying, you know, we shouldn't focus on fixing Gilligan's Island, just start building Sesame Street. So instead of thinking about how to fix it or remodel it, build a new model. Just let the fuckery fuck, but just build, I don't know, that's the most doctoral way I can say that. Just focus on building those new models. So instead of focusing on what you can't fix, right? Because there's no real way, you can't fix stupid, right? So let's just enlarge and amplify the good and make that the public space. And there was actually another, a scholar in there who made the analogy of like a battlefield, like on war, and you have medics. So what would a digital medic look like and so actually, what else did he say? Oh yeah, so he was like, I write posters everywhere. And he was like, preventative medicine and digital fields. So instead of it being like in a real battlefield, it would be like post-injury, right? Like you get shot and then they fix you. So in a digital space, a medic would be more preventative, teaching you digital literacy, teaching you how to combat, how, you know, we can make in the back end more applications to control features of like muting, reporting, all those things. So it would be preventative medicine in a digital space. And that, since that is now like our new public, our new water cooler, our new bar stool. So I just thought that was really interesting because that, like, literally those things just came up over the last couple of weeks or couple of days this week.
I think Tunisha makes a really interesting point there, that something about digital popular culture is its more immediacy. Like, I think it happens much quicker, like in terms of thinking like this through temporality. And I didn't even kind of think about this to what you said just now, but it happens much more quickly. Like, you know, a meme goes across Twitter, and, you know, I've definitely had these moments where I don't get on Twitter all day and then I've missed like 6 jokes and 6 memes and don't understand what's going on. So I think when we talk about digital popular culture, that the absolutely rapid pace of it is something that we have to consider in our definition.
Brings in the pop of popular a little bit more, perhaps.
Sure, yeah, because that missing out, that's that FOMO, right? The psychology behind it. Like, what's that? What is that about? Like, oh, I missed it. And I feel fun. I get fun out of sometimes like catching up. And I'm like, oh, okay, now I get it. And then I look for new ways or like, you know, new opportunities to be like, oh, like that joke would fit in perfectly, you know, or like that meme. And that's how things just continue to be recycled. And then you could bring back like old things and how the nostalgia starts to play in that, because oftentimes like that pop and pop culture, it's something that's when old becomes new again. And it's that new form of just radically reinventing like what's viral, what's popular. Oftentimes it's nothing's new anymore. We just remix it or put a hashtag in front of it and all of a sudden it's 2021.
I think that one thing that has stood out to me, partly from doing interviews with people across a pretty broad spectrum of ages, which I wasn't expecting for the dissertation work that I'm doing, but one of the things that has struck me in the academic space in particular are the ways that right now the challenge with what is popular is that you have a pretty tremendous separation of people who are pretty conversant with the culture of digital space and medias, and people who know that other people have this thing, but it isn't their culture. And so a lot of what I've spent time doing in academic spaces is, for example, I work mostly through folklore. You know, I'm talking to older folklorists who are not as engaged digitally and saying, here are things that are happening, here are cultural norms online that you absolutely recognize as a folklorist, but instead of happening in a physical town in a country that everybody can identify on a map, these are happening in spaces that aren't on your map. They're spaces that other people, of course, know about and spend a lot of time in, and you don't know about them. So you're ignoring that this is actually a really significant form of, I would just call it culture, but mass culture or popular culture, because this is what most people, I'm gonna say 40-ish and under, are at least aware of, if not pretty much centering their lives around. And not knowing how the space works, I think, is a really important marker of this schism right now. It's not that you don't know how the elements work, but this has developed slightly different practices, and you haven't gotten into this cultural group. The catch being, like, this culture is millions of people. Mm-hmm. It's not some people, some places. Digital culture is millions of people across the world. Absolutely, there are dynamics of who is in, who is not, who's able to join, who's not able. But I also think that that is one of the challenges with popular culture, especially for me from a folklore perspective, is that we have popular culture in the real world that is also digital, but we also have digital popular culture that isn't physically present for a lot of people. Or you can be involved in both. That's kind of a new place to be in. And I think that that has made it much harder, at least for me, to think about what counts as digital popular culture, because the digital culture part is so significant.
I think both terms, like what is popular culture, that's a complicated word that you have to figure out, or a complicated term. You have to figure out where the root wad and the root is separated. It has like sort of fuzzy boundaries. And then you add the digital culture element, which also has fuzzy boundaries. And then if you're talking about them in tandem, it becomes hard to sort of pin down what it is. Like trying to talk about the digital vernacular or talk about folk culture or elite culture. Which bin do you want to sort it in? Because they're not perfectly hermetically sealed spaces. There's a lot of bleeding in from the physical world into the digital space, which is interesting. At those liminal spaces between those two worlds is really interesting. But they're fuzzy terms. And then when you combine the two, it gets doubly fuzzy.
And then you have terms like techno culture, and how is that different than digital pop culture? I personally struggle with like adding other words to culture. It's just culture, and then, you know, culture is the umbrella, and you just, you know, like Matthew and Jasmine, you were saying, like you just kind of find different iterations of the culture concept. Like in my own research, I study social media content creators, but I'm not focused on platforms specifically. Usually, like they're going to create wherever whatever platform is cool, that's where they're going to be at. So that's not my concern. I'm concerned about the people. And I have this thing, I have a podcast that's rooted in my research called Black in Real Life. And this idea that I'm Black online, but I'm also Black in real life. Like these people who are producing online content, they are still real people. And what are their lives like offline, and how do the offline lives and the context of their offline existence and their embodiments inform the online content? So that's the connection between the physical and the digital, to me, is important, because you can't really have one without the other, because it informs the way people are able to become popular online, or even just to make a living online. Like your physical embodiments determines a lot about your ability to make a living as a content creator.
Yeah, and that idea of, especially when we think about that age difference too, and it still surprises me that we have people who still think that the digital and the physical are just these two separate realms that don't have any overlap between them, and that you don't have to take as seriously what happens in the digital. I still find that fascinating, that and I think here what happened in the United States on January 6th is an indication that there is still not enough understanding of, like you're all saying, how intertwined everything truly is these days, how it is just, you know, cultures.
There's literally like what's happening right now on like Clubhouse today. So I'm not personally on Clubhouse yet, because I just value my own sanity, but I follow the exploits of it on Twitter. And one of the latest happenings is that Tiffany Haddish, among other people, they may be called hoteps, if you're familiar with that word, they started to essentially dox this doctor or PhD student who was trying to give them more accurate information about like COVID. I suppose that they were spreading misinformation about like health stuff. And she's like, no, let me tell you like the truth. And then they just all attacked her, and then she attempted to self-harm herself. So something that happened in the digital world definitely impacted her physical experience. And these are the connections that we need to acknowledge more.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing a lot of people say is sort of this widening understanding of time and space. Jessica, you were talking about time and things happening quickly, and you know, Jasmine, you're sort of talking about this divide between people who are or are not online. But then even it's got me thinking about, if you're on TikTok at all, this language that could probably be applied to a lot of platforms where they're like, oh, have you gotten to witch TikTok yet? Or queer pastor TikTok, as if they are physical corners of a physical space. We use physical language to talk about something virtual, which I think is something that's happened since the dawn of virtual spaces, is we use physical logic, spatial reasoning, and exactly what you're saying, Anuli, that it has impacts in all, or what Matthew was saying about things bleeding. It's not, these things aren't just severed, but they still feel like they inhabit different spaces. So acknowledging both the differences but the connections is, I think, a big part of digital culture. Is it exists in a space we call digital, but is digital within physical spaces? I mean, then you could start getting really like metaphysical with it, but ultimately it's making us ask questions about what does it mean to be a human being in 2021, where we live a lot of our lives in virtual digital spaces, and we still have physical lives and spaces, and how does that work? And everybody has a different answer to that, right? That's sort of the trick.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that, and that's what really motivated me to, you know, get the media psychology PhD, because that psych component is everything. This is all about the human experience and how our relationships with media and technology impact our lives. So by looking at those patterns between like what media consumption and human behavior, that's where you start to see that these things are truly connected and related. And it's to say that so there's, with those questions and that everyone can ask, like that's why there needs to be such more emphasis on educating in digital literacy and in multiple spaces, in corporate spaces, workspaces. Everything right now, because of the pandemic, has obviously forced people, for the first time, start to think about, oh, this is like, oh, okay, so I could do this on digital now, like, blah, blah, blah. Like we're radically reinventing what it's like to be a student, to be a doctor, to be a parent, to be a teacher, to be a marketer, an athlete, whatever. So everything is going to be remodeled, and that idea of normalcy continues to be defined. And I think too, a big part of what that intent needs to be, or what needs to be included in that answer, has to be about what happens in digital spaces is not less valuable as something in a physical space. If somebody called me a hoe in a bar, as opposed to like someone tweeted me hoe, like it still sucks. So there is no difference. And just on the positive side, those that I've met and interacted with, that I've met online, I care more for than those that I went to high school with or college with. So the fact that it's value over volume, and that the way we need to just start educating people on, especially in C-suites across the board, that it's about the experience, not necessarily the utility of which it provided that experience. So I've always tried to say, even in my dissertation, it's like, it's not for sports, for example, like it's not about the box scores or stats line. The experience is what lasts far beyond any type of product or service. Like there's no expiration date on those types of things. And so which is per Anuli's point, that like, yeah, lots of self-harm, bullying, like this stuff happens because the interactions that we get has severe offline consequences. And some people, so there's just so much work that needs to be done in that, intersecting with even mental health then, because then this needs to be an area of emphasis on how to help and provide therapy and support and resources for digital based therapy and empathy.
Christine?
Yeah, I was just going to build off of this idea, and the point that you just made, Tunisha, is a really good one. Something that I do, at least in my classes, is part of this is, I think, language and how we've kind of been trained to think about these digital spaces. We have this conception of like IRL, right? In real life, I'm this person, I do this thing. But the way that I kind of break it down is exactly what you just said, Tunisha, is a friend that you've made in an online game. You talk to them every single day. You share details about your life with this person. You share these emotional experiences with them. Is that somehow less impactful than someone that you in your everyday life, you don't really share anything with them, but they're in the same physical space as you? So I think part of it is that idea of IRL versus happening online, but also the proliferation of things that are going on online. There are so many different people that I could potentially be in any given space, and so many different ideas that I can engage with, and cultural spaces that I can visit potentially, that I think make it difficult to think about the consequences all the time that can happen in your actual physical world life from these online kind of communities and experiences.
I want to make sure we get to Christopher and Laura too, if you would like to add in at this point any reflections.
Yeah, I was very interested in what Heidi said about the importance of both the space and time. And I've been thinking a lot about this idea of time when consuming digital culture or digital popular culture. First of all, because of the joke that we've been making for almost a year now, of how time has become this like weird concept that we don't relate to anymore because of being at home, because of the being on front of the screen all the time. But also I was thinking about it in terms of media events, especially, well, with what happened in the US last week, and how this would become a media event through television images, but how it is so weird to consume it when you are like from a different, first of all, in a different part of the world, but also what you were saying in this form of social media, when you're seeing tweets, the memes that developed the day after, 2 days after, the week after, and how these media events and media consumption expand through time. And I think it's also happening with certain online games. Like, for example, Among Us came out like 2 years ago or three years ago, it's gonna be now. And it became so popular just last year because of the situation that it was in. So the way that we consume it, when we consume things, and how we relate to what we consume in terms of time, it's become really contingent to the way we understand digital culture, I think.
And the example of Among Us shows another example of how intertwined that digital and that physical is, because if it wasn't for the physical situation, that digital situation may not have arisen.
Mm-hmm.
Christopher?
Yeah, I want to jump on the train that Christine mentioned, also sort of the transition from just talking about digital culture and to digital popular culture, for example, online games and the social connections you can make there. We had it also on, Tunisha had it on, for example, on social media, I think. And I think I want to throw in these connotations of positive and negative now. So it's really shaky what I was saying now. So I think it's really positive that this immediacy and this transition, or this interconnection through space and time, so you can experience or get into other people's experience if you share it, or share it together, for example, in video games. And it connects people through a new way other than the physical space, for example. So because we are limited, and the digitality overcomes this liminality, I would say. So that's my thoughts up to now.
That's, Christopher, that's really interesting that you bring up the sort of positive negative spectrum, right? Because that's where my sort of narrative religion things start firing off, because, you know, it's a positive thing that people who are stuck inside are playing Among Us, and teens are finding community even though they're trapped inside with their families, or that people who love sports find ways of connecting with each other online, like Tunisha's been talking about. And but then what happens when, like, a sort of influencer or a celebrity or creator like Anuli brought up, right, with like Tiffany Haddish or other people who use the same digital spaces of like people who are forming communities or looking to certain digital creators, and then it's used in ways that are bad. But then, like, what do we mean by that? And, you know, all of the people in QAnon would say that they're good and that they're fighting evil pedophiles. And if you really think that that's what's going on, and everyone in your digital community is telling you that that's what is real, then the whole black and white good bad is very obvious to you. So I mean, I'm super interested in what you were talking about, Tunisha, about the idea of like a medic, sort of a digital medic coming in, but then who makes up those rules, and what does that mean, and who's sick and who's not sick, and who needs help and who doesn't need help, and then it feels very overwhelming. But I mean, I guess these are the important questions to be asking.
Right, because I never thought of that either until dude said it yesterday, and I was like, And I'm thinking it's more probably like, I don't know if it's one of those like 24 help self-check or 24/7, you know, things like on Twitter or something, or if it's just asking applications to enforce more, more privacy features or anything else where like you can report tweets, mute, those types of things, or even like one of the latest things that they did where it's like, if you retweet an article, it gives you a notification like, sure, you don't want to read it first? So you're not just spreading it. And I'm like, oh yeah, I guess it's true. So if it's just including more things like that, so to try and help offset problems in the future. So it's just trying to think more ahead, but certainly who's regulating that, who's defining that, and making sure that no one marginalized or no one is continuing to be even further marginalized, in these spaces. So I think, yeah, it's a good place to start thinking, but requires certainly much more, thought, and probably never a copy and paste situation either. Like what you do for one isn't, you can't do for another. But I think the main point of that medic analogy is to just acknowledge that this is a space, period. Mm-hmm. And it's not, necessarily one that, it's a space. And so it needs to have the amount of attention and design, access, and accessibility as you would any physical space.
I think that's helpful.
The way that I've been approaching it with my students, as I talk about how, the digital space is a communication space. It doesn't exist except through mediation, except through these types of symbolic languages we've been creating for such a long time, which in some ways is very similar to the physical spaces, of course, because we layer on top of the objective all of our subjective narratives and these fictive realities that we come up with. But I think for a lot of people, that is still a harder transition to understand because they are so used to this idea of this is something physical I can do and I can touch you and I know not to touch you and things like that. But we don't understand it when it's just a purely communicative space and how words do matter. I mean, we still have people who don't understand that words do matter. So there's that aspect of this too. And how do we get to that type of digital literacy, maybe, is another question too. How do we help popular culture? How do we help cultures within these spaces populated by individuals with physical maladies? How do we help them to exist in these spaces? Is that something that popular culture studies could help with?
I'm reading through this great book right now, and I was fumbling around my desk looking for it, by Annette Markham and Katrin Teidenberg. And it's called Metaphors of the Internet. And it's this edited collection, and they basically apply metaphor theory to so much of aspects of internet life and culture. And for instance, one of the great things I loved in the introduction, it said, so much of our understanding of the internet is through this idea of metaphor. Like we talk about the cloud, and well, the cloud is just a safe way, a nice way of saying my data lives on somebody else's computer. Right? The cloud isn't this amorphous thing that just kind of, hangs out around our heads. It's somebody else's computer is where our data is being stored. So I think the idea of rethinking and critically interrogating the metaphors we use to describe the internet. And I don't know about y'all, but if I hear one more pundit or journalist talk about what happened here in the US on 1/6 as it came from the dark corners of the internet, no, it didn't. It came from right out in the open on YouTube. It came from right out in the open on TikTok and on Reddit. And we're seeing this purge now, but it wasn't the dark corners. So this is, again, that problem with place, the problem with metaphor, that when we use the wrong conceptions of place or the wrong conceptions of metaphor, it has practical, offline, embodied consequences.
That makes me think of something my mom always said: nothing is new in this world, and it isn't, right? Like the same complaints people have about like technology is the same complaints people had about like the pencil when it came out, or like, book publishing when it started, like all of these new technologies, the gramophone, like people, or radio, like it's these conversations are not new. It's always like usually older generations poo-pooing the things that the younger generations like, and that's just the worlds that we live in. But I do want to address the part of the question about like what can our scholarship do to help. And I will say, just speaking from my own, the funny thing about me is that I didn't like finish undergrad and think that I'd ever go back to school for anything. I'm like, I'm fine working in marketing. It's fine. And I did consumer research, but then I started to, I would do these studies, like these big brands, like multinational brands, pay our agency money for me to do these studies about their consumers, give them the results. Here are the results. And they'll say, well, no, I don't believe what you're saying because my one friend thinks differently. I'm like, well, I don't know what to tell you now. Or I would say something like, well, there is a discrepancy in your campaigns for Black content creators compared to your general market content creator campaigns. And they'll say, no, they're perfectly the same. And I'm like, I've seen your budgets. The budgets are different. Or they'll say, like, we don't treat people differently. So part of the reason I wanted to go back to school to study this is because I knew that I could do all the consumer research studies that I could want until like my brain went insane. But they would not believe me until some scholar came out with a study that says it, then maybe The Atlantic or Wired picked it up and wrote an article about it, and then they read it during their morning coffee and they're like, oh, this thing is real now. Like, you're not going to believe it when I tell you based off of the study that I did for you with your budget. But once someone that is, you know, it's a hierarchy of intelligence, right, or expertise. Once someone that is considered to be an expert in, you know, academia says that something is true, people listen to it. So that's a part of the reason I went back to school, because I see the power dynamics, and I knew that I wasn't going to make that change without being the person that makes the studies that people write about. And then they're like, oh, I believe you now, even though I'm still the same person I was before I went. So, I mean, we have to acknowledge the hierarchy and the power structures within academia that allows like knowledge to be distributed in certain ways that, like, when we say something is true, right, people will listen to it a little more.
That's such a good point, Anuli, because I think that also brings up the way that digital spaces has, in a way, flattened access, right? Or it seemingly gives equal access. Now, on the one hand, yes, like a lot of people, if you have internet, you can pick up a phone or a computer and Google something or Wikipedia something, you know, these verbs we use. But then what are you doing with it? And in what ways is someone, like you said, who has expertise sort of looking at the same information differently in a larger landscape? And I mean, I feel exhausted by the number of conversations I've had with people that, you know, I was the same way. I went to film school, did not think that I would be doing this much school, but, you know, to try to convince someone, like, I don't think I'm better than you because I'm doing more school. I'm just spending a lot of time with something that I find interesting and I can't stop doing. But that the people that spend this much time with something, the fact that you are spending so much time, not only in your real world IRL, you know, career in marketing, but that you're actually spending a different kind of time, a different sort of sitting with, you know, in an academic setting, it gives you a certain kind of expertise. But we're seeing this absolutely crumble right now, right? That no one cares if you're an expert. No one cares if you have a degree. No one cares how much time you've spent. Well, I read this thing, or my uncle told me this thing, or my mom works over here. I mean, it's like you can be friends with as many nurses as you want, and they all tell you the same thing. COVID is serious and it is real and we should take it seriously. But they're like, I read this article that shows that like more people died in 2019 than 2020. So it doesn't seem like it's a big deal. And you're like, like, where are you getting this? And the internet is the place where we say, where are you getting this? As if, again, like Jessica said, there's like mysterious dark corners of information that's different than the out loud corners, but really it's just like a town square of people throwing flyers at you. Again, now I'm using metaphors. The metaphors help. I mean, I'm a fan of them, but you know, I will just say one thing. I'm also just finished a really great book by Andrew Marantz, who writes for The New Yorker. It's called Antisocial, and he talks about sort of alt-right and extremist groups and like this techno-utopia idea, and how a lot of the mavericks who sort of started these different spaces, Reddit, Twitter, Facebook, etc., sort of saw themselves as like disruptors and kind of going rogue and like having an open square. And what I found helpful in that book, among many other things, very readable, that he uses the metaphor of a warehouse party. So like, if you understand Reddit as a warehouse party, in what ways do you let someone come in and like start a bar fight? In what ways do you not? And you know, what happens if in a dark corner, some people are talking about something like anti-Semitism, and you're like, well, they're just talking about it. And then what happens if 50 people are talking about it? And then what happens if they all have matching t-shirts? And then what happens when they all storm the Capitol, right? It's like, if they all storm the bar and take the liquor, then them just talking about it. Anyway, then we get into the digital physical again. But I think that gets back to this idea of, I think sometimes even metaphors help us understand how we can actually implement these things. Because on the one hand, it needs to be new, but on the other hand, it needs the spirit of things that we already understand. We understand a party, we understand a bar, we understand a classroom, we understand if you go to a Thanksgiving dinner table, like that these are different things that have certain rules. So in what ways are certain spaces in the internet invoking that same spirit of the same rule? But then what does that actually look like, right? Does that look like Twitter putting out bans? Or suddenly does that feel worse? But maybe it's the same thing, it's just seems different.
I do think that one of the pieces that came up before, I don't know who was talking about it exactly, but the idea of literacies is one that stands out to me because it, you know, very similarly, we say literacies like digital literacy or pop culture literacy means literacy in everything that falls under that category. And that also is, of course, a conversation in public health literacy, or just health literacy, especially in a pandemic. But one of the things that strikes me is how quickly the number of literacies has skyrocketed. You know, so you can be particularly literate at the norms and practices and culture on Facebook, maybe just Facebook of the people that you're connected to, but you can be literate at using Facebook online. And at exactly the same time, not be literate at something else that is also online, because online is lots of things. And we're not all on the same things, which I think has happened a couple of times. People have certainly mentioned platforms in this conversation where I've been to note, gotta look that one up, don't know what's happening there. But I think that the idea of literacies, much like the idea of what is popular culture, you know, gives us a moment to have conversations about like what are the things where people have found other people. What are the ways that digital spaces have made that maybe more possible, which is why we're seeing this explosion of so many people who are so literate at that particular thing, while a bunch of people, even in their peer networks, aren't. But one of the pieces I think that comes up is that, but that also means that how you manage the spaces and, you know, what the ideal of any particular type of literacy or space is. How do you do that? And we see that, for example, because I'm looking at fan fiction and I'm looking particularly on Archive of Our Own, we see conversations about, you know, what is it to understand the space? What is it to police this space? When is it something that some collective we agree needs to be policed? And when is it something where we haven't gotten there? And you have conversations about that, for example, with like, what is it that we all agree can be understood as a trigger that you need to tell people is present in a story? And what isn't? And one of the conversations that happens, particularly with interviews I did with other Black, Indigenous people of color, was that racism in particular isn't one of those things. that is considered not just like I can prefer or not prefer to see it, but is it benign or actively harmful? And usually that benign or actively harmful is that content warning or that trigger warning that I think most of us are familiar with in a number of spheres. But who, when, who, where, how do you decide that that thing is the best it can be for that thing? Because it's not usually best for everybody. And I mean, I don't know how that shows up in other people's work, but I'm assuming that most of the work that the people do in this conversation, you have some group of people who aren't in support of the sort of approved best version of the thing that you're looking at, or maybe the group itself, maybe the interest itself is the thing that other people don't approve of. But it seems important to the idea of, where is the power, what is the expertise, who gets to say that, and when does it count? And I don't know how to put all of those pieces together, but I think that just the sheer number of ways that shows up for people, even just in this conversation, I mean, tells us how important it is to even get to that point in a conversation. I have my slight tangent here to kind of return to Carolyn's question about what is popular culture in the context of digital space or digital forms. One of the things that I have found fascinating through sort of fandom and fan fiction is just the way that, like, if it's popular to a couple of other people who you can join with and share, it becomes a thing that people would call popular culture, even if the thing that marks it as popular is that, like, it's your thing and all of these people just don't know about it, they don't understand, we can't believe they're not interested. But sometimes it's popular culture if everybody's like, this is what marks you as important or good or socially relevant or whatever it is. And I think that we see that happening more and more with things that were small or that start in particular communities that are marginalized for it and then gets removed and becomes a source of power that everybody else gets to claim and they then have no ownership of, but also aren't recognized for. I think that maybe Anuli has probably seen some of that in her work with especially Black influencers, and I'm guessing, but I don't know for sure, I'm guessing that Christopher and Laura might also see that a little bit in their work, but I can't say why I'm guessing that, so I'm hoping they'll fill in.
I think what you're saying it's very interesting in terms of how much more important social capital becomes within the internet, within digital spaces, and how, because first of all, because of how echo chambers are created and how we move in these very specific spaces. What Jessica was saying, it's not dark corners, but it's specific corners. It's like if you leave Q&A and you are gonna have all these people that do the same thing. And then you also share content that goes along with that because it's social capital. That's what you're expected to do, and it works the same in fan fiction. Because I also did I did my undergrad dissertation on fan fiction, so everything that you're saying sounds very familiar to me, and it works exactly like this. And there are certain ships that are very frowned upon because of different reasons, and the way that these discussions sometimes become very aggressive. It's just, I find it very interesting. It's just baffling to me how these people who actually like the same thing can get to this point of this very violent relationship to the thing that they like, and how these little communities become more little and more specific to just this one thing that I like, and I hate everything else with a passion.
That sounds very much like religious schisms, not to veer back into that corner, but because we're talking about corners. But that, I mean, I do think that at the very least metaphorically is helpful in understanding if someone really finds something meaningful, which again goes back to when we're trying to figure out how do we monitor these spaces or bring in extra tools to make sure things are equitable or things aren't overly triggering and attacking and that are in fact welcoming. I actually really like that point that Tunisha said about creating like imaginative welcoming spaces rather than just fixing and policing the ones that are sort of broken or stupid. And I think that is part of it, right? It's the same sort of thing. Like instead of, you know, trying to convert everyone, it's more like, well, this is an invitational collaborative space or belief or fandom or group. So that's why I love that sort of fandom religion connection, because there's the same spirited passion that shows up in both. Absolutely.
I think that's, sorry.
Go ahead, Christine.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that's also related to that proliferation that I mentioned earlier. Like, for example, if you're looking at Archive of Our Own, AO3, fan fiction there is going to be a little bit different than fan fiction on Tumblr. People are going to receive it differently. There are going to be different norms about how you talk about it, even different ships that are highlighted for different fandoms. But that is part of this idea of these different people coming together in these different groups, and they suddenly start to develop these different likes and dislikes and ideas about how to act around each other and norms about what's acceptable in terms of language. And in a lot of ways, like, it makes it so much more fascinating to look at things like pop culture in digital spaces because of all of that diversity that you end up seeing in terms of expression. But it also makes it so much more difficult to even know what's going on in so many of these spaces.
And on top of that, then too, you have so many different spaces where you do have echo chambers, whatever you want to call it, and you don't have people who are then talking to each other, so that they end up in very different versions of reality, essentially. And it makes me think about, it would be great if we could get back to more of that communal space that's opening and welcoming to everyone. But I wonder how much that's even possible now, given the buy-in that people have to be willing to engage with things that are different. And it makes me think about, Matthew, how you're saying you're trying to help, educators develop online teaching, which is something I've had to do for years now as well at my university. And the resistance to even some of the most basic ways of doing online communication, because it doesn't align with what they've done before. So I think we can create the space. I'm going to go to the metaphor of Field of Dreams. If you build it, maybe they'll come, but there's no guarantee they're going to come. So we have to think about, well, how do we get that buy-in too? Otherwise, are we just going to have very fractured, little, splintered, schismed digital popular cultures where it's just, me and my friends, and that's all I need?
Yeah, can we talk about the switch to like the digital? Because I find a lot of what has happened in the past year very ableist. I take a lot of inspiration from like disability studies. Like I think they're like ahead of the curve in a lot of things. And like for like years, particularly I'm thinking like deaf students, right? Like they wanted abilities to have like digital accessibility ways to learn, right? Like how do you learn online? Like how do you use like video chat? Like I was watching like Deaf U on Netflix. It's a really good reality show, but I learned so much about the deaf community from that show. Just like FaceTime is so important because you can now do your gestures there. And there are communities that have been asking for this for years. Like this didn't have to be like this last minute ditch that we all did in March. Like we could have been setting up to like teach students in a way that is more like inclusive, even just to work. Like why do I have to go into the office every day if I'm not going to talk to you? like I could just work a few days at home. Like we didn't have to do all this. So I just wanted to get people's thoughts on that. I just find it so laughable because I just remember asking for years the ability to like work a few days outside of the office, because I am actually more productive then. Like people think, oh, you're going to be more productive if you come in. No, I'm not. You're coming to my desk every 10 minutes to ask me a question about something. I'm more productive at home, me personally.
Yeah, I think once again, it just sort of widens our understandings of things. And I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned this last year is imagination and flexibility and curiosity. When people don't have those things or are resistant to those things, that's where you really see some of these clashes. So no, we always go to the office. That's the way it's always been. Well, why has it always been that way? Literally factory settings, right? You joke, you could use the phrase factory settings, but it's because the 9 to 5, go to work, commute, etc., was literally because of physical factories. And now, exactly your point. Now, on the one hand, there are some of us who are a little extroverted who like to be a little distracted at our desk, but that doesn't mean everyone should go to the office or everyone should work from home. But once again, imagining different ways that you could create a workspace, create a work week, create schooling, and not all schools should be online. Kindergartners should probably be in a space together physically, and like run around. I think that's been very clear. But does every single grad student need to be in every single classroom? No, there are all these different ways of doing things that people benefit from. And I'm absolutely, I think I'm invigorated to be in spaces with people who are trying to imagine things rather than feeling really discouraged by how different things have been or how hard things have been, but that we could take it as an opportunity to come up with new things, and that it doesn't have to be this dark roadblock, but that it can actually be a fruitful new avenue for being flexible and being curious about other people. And exactly to your point, the fact that we haven't even thought about this until we were pushed up against the wall, like, oh, maybe we should all turn our captions on, is, I mean, I think once again, it just shows the world is not full of, I don't know, no, I guess normal, right? So normal is once again a word that should be expanded or rethought, or you hate to say eradicated because I don't know, it's still useful in comparison, I guess. But yeah, I agree that we should be far more thoughtful about the things that we essentially have been thoughtless about or careless about. And I think people with disabilities and people doing disability studies are, I think you're absolutely right. Those are the people who are paying the most attention and the most careful attention to some of these things.
And Anuli, I think also, so I'm disability studies adjacent, but a bunch of people on Twitter that I follow, and I've been particularly interested in Black Girl ADHD Twitter threads. But one of the conversations that I think has been really valuable, especially from disability studies and disability activism, is the idea of when it is a thing that people in power to make decisions for change decide that it's a priority for change. And at my university, at least, part of the conversation that I've been in as a person who's disability studies and disability activism adjacent is that, things like, well, what do we do if all of a sudden people don't have the materials like the computer or the solid internet access to do this thing? Let's figure out how to make it possible for everybody because we recognize how important this is going to be. But part of the feedback then is, well, you have a significant number of students with disabilities at your university. Whether you recognize and accept their disabilities for what they are, you have disabled students. And disabled students have been offering information and insight into their needs and the ways that you can make spaces not just more inclusive for them, but for more people, and the ways that different spaces work differently across student bodies. Some students really, really like online engagement, not because it's more accessible physically or it's easier, but that the ways that their minds work are maybe better through the way that your material shows up in your online course than it does when you stand in front of them and talk and kind of show a couple of words on screen periodically, or only mass text instead of a 5-minute video like you put on your online website. And the conversation around disability has been really interesting because the things that we're implementing to handle the pandemic are a lot of the things that have been requested for over a decade. And all of a sudden, it's clearly possible. And it's not that technologically most of these things have not been possible, but they certainly haven't been prioritized. And part of the importance of this for me is that that's much like witnessing white complacency during protests against police violence, especially against Black and brown bodies. It is a moment of people who are marginalized or who are being harmed, recognizing that you could have stopped that. You could have done the work to make this not harmful or to make this more possible, and have chosen not to, as people in positions to make those decisions. And so one of the things that I do in my department now, I also have a staff job at my university. I work as a fellowship advisor. But one of the conversations in my professional organization is, what are the skills that we didn't learn and haven't been learning that we can at least learn now so that that accessibility stays longer than the pandemic, which is one of the concerns, I think, for rightly so, for a number of disability activists. Is it only until the pandemic ends and then we remove all of these things that we've put in that make it accessible? And that includes things like most of our staff and faculty aren't trained with how to do captions or what your options are for getting captioning, or how, for example, to organize a layout that's maybe ADHD friendly or dyslexia friendly. How do you have all of these different approaches? And also, how do you recognize that sometimes the needs of different populations just don't match? You can't use a thing for everybody and have it work. Those are unfortunately kind of new, widespread conversations, at least for the groups that I'm in. But I think that the value is that we're also recognizing that we could have been taught that. I'm sure most of you as students, you do workshops, you learn skills. If you're teaching, you learn to teach in some way. That wasn't ever part of my teaching education. I wasn't taught also how to do captions on videos if I was sharing those. Just told that if you have to do captions, you can submit a video for captions. But it was never something that you would do by choice. You would do because you had to. And I think that those are important conversations to be able to point to people and go, but why was that your choice when it wasn't the only thing possible?
And I think we're coming up to like the full hour here, so I kind of want to get us into a wrap-up mode. But I will say, if I hear one more person say they want to return to normalcy, or they can't wait to go back to normal, or that we have a new normal, I'm going to lose it, because that is such a loaded concept at this point. And I think we see it in education, but definitely in so many other aspects of our lives, but even digital popular culture. And that sense of it's not normal because it's digital. And once the pandemic is done, everything will go back to normal popular culture, which the heck does that mean? So I thought maybe just to wrap things up, if anyone wants to put in any final comments, maybe what they're thinking about looking at with digital popular culture, and how you're looking at it, I think that'd be a good way to wrap up our conversation and maybe find, specific topics we can touch upon in an upcoming dialogue.
Yeah, I think I'm interested in seeing the ways in which things deemed as popular culture, as in maybe a hobby or play or extracurricular, or which sometimes that can be positive, but often it's wielded negatively, right? Or dismissed maybe, but how that's actually very instrumental and often interacts with maybe things that aren't dismissed so much. So, ways in which being part of a community can really bring you a lot of life and friendships, and especially during these times when we're inside or we're not able to connect with people physically. So really seeing that like digital to physical like certain physical or communal or emotional needs met through digital spaces and digital communities. But then again, sort of asking ourselves what happens when your needs are met in a community that like actively seeks to harm other communities, and what do we do with that, you know? And so we can talk about policing certain things online, but where are we drawing these lines, and who are we drawing them from or with? Maybe is a better question. Who are we drawing these lines with? Whose input are we seeking out to you know, create these sorts of things? I find that, and you know, it sounds like a lot of us are in that same realm of, we can't, you know, maybe we kind of all got here because we were sort of interested in some element of like fandom or play or fun. And then you're like, oh, why does this get dark so often? And, you know, is it back to what Jessica was saying with time, right? Is it that like things just are happening so quickly? So like, of course they will quickly devolve into some, like the darkest version of it. Or was that inevitable even in like non-digital spaces? Or was it not inevitable? So anyway, that was too many things, but.
Yeah, I agree with Heidi that you're studying the pop culture, it gets dark very quickly. Like I tell people I'm writing a book about the internet called The Internet is for Cats, and it's like, that's so cute. I was like, so let me tell you how fast that got dark too. So I think that's something that we always, you know, have to reckon with and defend as pop culture scholars, that yeah, it isn't always positive and it isn't always negative, and it's both and it's neither, and it's always in that messy gray area in the middle.
So like I'm in an anthropology department, which is a very interesting place to do digital work, in that they are very behind in general, the discipline. But because you have to go to like a physical field site, like I get that question like, okay, so you study like internet influencers, where is your field site? I'm like, well, to me, actually regionality and place is very important to this work that I'm doing. So like I focus on content creators in the US specifically, but I'm very also focused on regions in the US and how that informs internet culture. So I came into this dissertation project wanting to have LA as my field site, because that's where the influencer marketing industry is booming. Like a lot of content creators move to LA because of its association with Hollywood. But because my project is focused on Black content creators specifically, I've been actually interested in the role of the South, because a lot of internet trends start from people located in the South, specifically Georgia. Like Atlanta, Georgia, as a content creation hub is very fascinating to me. So I'm moving towards like that for my project, because a project about Los Angeles would be more about how Black content creators are navigating white spaces, whereas a project based in Atlanta would be more about how Black content creators are making new spaces for themselves. And I think that's closer to like my personal intention in this work, or the activist side of it.
What I saw in this conversation was we touched it from different perspectives, and in the end there was always this question, how can we teach what we think at the moment? How can we things make better, I would say, so to bring the positive negative aspect in again. So and I think we shouldn't just teach popular culture in itself, or digitality, or digital culture, or the specific subject we are an expert in, but also how we approach it, you know, and what we think about it. So for example, not saying here's, I don't know, this music genre and you learn these data about it, and then the students just make a standardized test in the end, get an A+ and that's it. But I think we should give them our methods, how we approach these topics on a reflexive level. So they also approach, if they encounter new problems in life, not only academic problems, but also social problems. So they have this reflexive thinking about the topics, and so they can, it's just a frame, and they can fill it up with their personal experience and approach these new problems in the future.
Any other final thoughts?
I do. I think one thing that I leave most conversations with is, I think, similar to Christopher's point, this sort of idea of not just teaching, but sort of being transparent with how people do the work that they do and what the approaches are, and why is it that maybe you share an approach but the questions are different, or what does that mean if your questions and approaches are different and you find similar things, or what if they're the same and you find different things across different fields. So one of the things that I just enjoy, particularly in popular culture studies, is that when people start to tell you how they do their work, it creates this wonderful moment of saying, well, even if I don't share the interest that you do in maybe that particular type of music or that particular literature or even that particular space, how you do that work is something that I can think about and wonder, how does that apply to this thing that I am interested in, or this thing that is particularly relevant right now, even if outside of the political relevance, I'm not interested, or I won't be interested next month, but it is worth our time now. That idea of methods and popular culture and the ways that different things can be approached from different areas and in different ways, I think is really interesting and really valuable. And I think that for the students that I've taught, those have been some of the most fruitful conversations, because that people approach questions differently, I think, gets lost as we specialize. You learn how to approach things with questions in your field, you learn what the tools are, and I think that you lose sight of actually how many tools and questions and approaches are possible until someone tells you, well, I also was interested in the same thing, but here's how I went about it. And I have enjoyed kind of hearing how different people in this conversation have done that work, because it gives me new tools to look up and new ways to think about my own questions.
It's that curiosity, that imagination, that flexibility that a number of you have been talking about. And I think that's something that digital popular culture has helped us learn more about. I mean, as Heidi is just saying, interdisciplinary studies, popular culture has really become a great location for this, just even fan studies to an extent as well. And I think the digital is helping us to expand that even further when we think about digital popular culture. So I'm going to wrap it up here now, because this has been a great conversation. I feel we could go all night, but I think Christopher and Laura would love to be able to go to sleep at some point soon. And I know I need supper. So thank you, everyone, for coming to the conversation. We're definitely going to have more of these. I think our next one is actually on material popular culture. So it'll be interesting to see how they, in that conversation, how we relate back to the digital. And as I said, if there's ever any of these topics that we want to explore more, happy to do so. Zoom's making it wonderfully possible now. So thank you, everyone, for coming by and being a part of this dialogue.
Thank you. Nice meeting everybody.
Nice meeting you all. See you on Twitter.